Good afternoon, ma'am and friends. Today, our group will present about the political economy of international trade. My name is Tara and I'll be the first to give the presentation. To start the presentation, I'll briefly explain the points that we will discuss in this presentation. We start this presentation by describing the range of policy instruments that governments use to intervene in international trade. Then it followed by a detailed review of the various political and economic motives that government have for intervention. In the third section of this presentation, we will discuss about the revised case for free trade. Then we will look at the emergence of the modern international trading system. And in the final section of this presentation, we will discuss about the implications of this material for management practice. So overall in this chapter, we will look at the political reality of international trade. Although many nations are nominally committed to free trade, in reality, they tend to intervene in international trade. When governments intervene, they often do so by restricting imports of goods and services into their nation while adopting policies that promote domestic production and export. Normally, their motives are to protect domestic producers and jobs from foreign competition while increasing the foreign market for product of domestic producers. Okay, the first thing that we will discuss is the instruments of trade policy. Government use 7 main trade policy instruments, which are tariffs, subsidies, import quotas, voluntary export restraints, local content requirement, administrative policies, and anti-dumping duties. The first instrument is tariffs. A tariff is a tax levied on imported goods and services. Tariffs fall into 2 categories. First is specific tariffs. Specific tariffs are levied as a fixed charge for each unit of a good imported. For example, $3 tariff per barrel of oil. The second is ad valorem tariffs. Ad valorem tariffs are levied as a proportion of the value of the imported good. For example, is 15% tariffs levied by Japan government on US automobile. In most cases, tariffs are placed on imports to protect domestic producers from foreign competition by raising the price of imported goods. The important thing to understand about an import tariff is who suffers and who gains. The government, of course, gains because the tariff increases government revenues. The domestic producer also gains because the tariff affords them some protection against foreign competitors by increasing the cost of imported foreign goods. Consumer lose because they must pay more for certain imported goods. So, in general, 2 conclusions can be derived from economic analysis of the effect of import tariffs. The first is tariffs are unambiguously pro-producer and anti-consumer. Because while they protect producers from foreign competitors, this restriction of supply also raises domestic price. For example, a study by Japanese economists calculated that tariffs on imports of foodstuffs, cosmetics, and chemicals into Japan cost the average Japanese consumer about $890 per year in the form of higher prices. Although almost all studies find that import tariffs impose significant costs on domestic consumers in the form of higher prices. The second is import tariffs reduce the overall efficiency of the world economy. They reduce efficiency because a protective tariff encourages domestic firms to produce products at home that in theory could be produced more efficiently abroad. and the consequence of this is an inefficient utilization of resources. Let's take an example. Tariffs on importation of rice in South Korea have led to an increase in rice production in that country. However, rice farming is an unproductive use of land in South Korea. It would make more sense for the South Koreans to purchase their rice from lower-cost foreign producer and to utilize the land now employed in rice production in some other way. For example, growing foodstuffs that cannot be produced more efficiently elsewhere, or for residential and industrial purposes. The second instrument is subsidies. Subsidies is a government payment to a domestic producer. Subsidies take many forms, including cash grants, low-interest loans, tax breaks, and government equity participation in domestic firms. By lowering production costs, subsidies help domestic producers in two ways. First is competing against foreign imports, and second is gaining export markets. The main gains from subsidies accrue to domestic producers, whose international competitiveness is increased. Advocates of strategic trade policy often favor subsidies to help domestic firms achieve a dominant position in those industries in which economies of scale are important and the world market is not large enough to profitably support more than a few firms. For example, is the aerospace industry. According to this argument, subsidies can help a firm achieve a first-mover advantage in an emerging industry. For example, subsidies historically were given to Boeing by US government to help them lower the cost of developing new commercial jet aircraft. In Boeing's case, subsidies came in the form of tax credits for R&D spending. It makes Boeing achieve a first-mover advantage in the aerospace industry until now. If first-mover advantage achieved, further gains to the domestic economy arise from the employment and the tax revenues that a major global company can generate. However, government subsidies must be paid for typically by taxing individuals and corporations. That's why consumers typically absorb the cost of subsidies.
Thank you, Tara, for the presentation. I am Luthfina, and now I would like to continue Tara's presentation about instruments of trade policy. The next policy is import quota. Import quota is a direct restriction on the quantity of some good that may be imported into a country. This policy is implemented by issuing imported licenses to a group of individuals or firms. For example, there is a recent news in Indonesia regarding buffalo meat import. Retrieved from business.com, our government has determined the import quota for buffalo meat is 170,000 tons for this year. It means that our country is not allowed to import more than 170,000 tons of buffalo meat. And here in this example, the licenses are given to only 3 firms. They are Perumbulok, PT Berdikari, and PT Perusahaan Perdagangan Indonesia. So, only those 3 firms that are allowed to import buffalo meat. On the previous slide, we have talked about import quota. Now, this policy is a hybrid of quota policy and tariff policy, which called tariff rate quota. Under a tariff rate quota, a lower tariff rate is applied to imports within quota, and for those over the quota, higher tariff rate will be applied. So this is an example of rice import in South Korea. As we can see here, there's a line in the middle of the graph which represents the quota limit. As seen in the graph, the quota limit for rice import is 1 million tons. If South Korea might import 2 million tons of rice, the tariff that will be applied is like this: 10% rate for the 1 million tons and 80% rate for another 1 million tons because the other 1 million exceeds the import quota. Import quotas and voluntary export restraints result in limited foreign supply. They also result in raising of the domestic price of an imported good. Therefore, they benefit the domestic producers, yet they do not benefit the consumers. Producers from exporting country will also benefit from quotas and voluntary export restraint because it will result in producers getting quota rent or can be referred as the extra profit producers make when supply is artificially limited by import quota. The next policy is local content requirement. This is a requirement that some specific fraction of a good must be produced domestically. The requirement can be expressed in two ways: physical terms and value terms. Physical terms state that a certain percentage of component parts of a product must be produced locally, while value terms state that a certain percentage of the value of a product must be produced locally. This regulation tends to benefit the producers, not the consumers. The last one from instruments of trade policy is administrative policy. Administrative policies refers to bureaucratic rules designed to make it difficult for imports to enter a country. As we know, in trade there is dumping. Dumping is a practice of selling goods in a foreign market below their fair value. So in administrative policy, there is anti-dumping policy. This policy is designed to punish foreign firms that engage in dumping. The ultimate objective is to protect domestic producers from unfair foreign competition. Again, this policy tends to benefit producers, not the consumers.
My name is David Ardian, and I would like to present about the case of government intervention in international trade. There are two arguments why the government should intervene in international trade. The first one is political arguments, and the second one is economical arguments. I will explain the political arguments, and later on, Bianca will explain the economical arguments. Okay. Political arguments on government intervention on international trade cover a range of issues, such as protecting jobs and industries, protecting industries deemed for national security, and the third one is retaliating against unfair foreign competitions. The fourth one is protecting consumers, and then furthering foreign policy objectives, and the last one is protecting human rights. Okay, so the first political argument is protecting jobs and industries. Perhaps the most common political argument for government intervention is that it is necessary for protecting jobs and industry from unfair foreign competitions. The example from European unions is they are established the Common Agricultural Political or CAP. The CAP was designed to protect the jobs of Europe's politically powerful farmers by restricting import and guaranteeing prices. The next one is national security. Countries sometimes argue that it is necessary to protect certain industries because they are important for national securities. Defense-related industries often get this kind of attentions. In Indonesia, there is PT Pindad, which is defense-related industries in Indonesia. And then in the US, there are some cases which semiconductors is protected from foreign competition in the US. It is because semiconductors are now such an important component of defense product that it would be dangerous or risky to rely primarily on foreign producers. Okay, the next political argument is retaliation. Some argue that government should use the threat to intervene in trade policy as a bargaining tool to have open foreign markets and force trading partners to play by the rules of the game. One of the examples is the US government used the threat of punitive trade sanctions to try to get the Chinese government to enforce its intellectual property laws. And then the next one is protecting consumers. Many governments have long had regulations to protect consumers from unsafe products. The indirect effect of such regulations often is to limit or ban the importation of such products. In Indonesia, the government has banned enoki mushroom that is produced from South Korea because it contains bacteria that is dangerous for consumption. The next political argument is furthering foreign policy. Governments sometimes use trade policy to support their foreign policy objectives. A government may grant preferential trade terms to a country with which it wants to build strong relationships. Trade policy has also been used several times to pressure or punish rogue states. The last one is protecting human rights. Protecting and promoting human rights in other countries is an important element of foreign policy for many democracies. Governments sometimes use trade policy to try to improve the human rights policies of trading partners. There is argument that says the best way to change the internal human rights stance of a country is to engage it through international trade. By growing bilateral trade, it raises the income levels of both countries, and as a country becomes richer, its people begin to demand and generally receive better treatment regarding to their human rights.
Okay, good morning everyone, and I'm going to continue the topic to talk about economic arguments for government intervention. We already discussed about the political arguments for government intervention before with David. So with the development of a new trade theory and strategic trade policy in the chapter 5 that we already discussed the last session, the economic arguments for government intervention have undergone a renaissance in recent years. Until the early 1980s, the economics saw a little benefit in government interventions and strongly advocate a free trade policy. This position has changed at the margins with the development of strategic trade policy. Although, as we will see in the next topic, in the next slides that I'm going to talk about, there are still strong economic arguments for sticking to a free trade stances. So let's go for the next slide. So we have two big economic arguments that we are going to talk in this that we're going to talk right now. So the first one is the infant industry argument. This argument is by far the oldest economic argument for government intervention. This argument was made by Alexander Hamilton, proposed at 1792. According to this government, many developing countries have a potential comparative advantage in manufacturing. But new manufacturing industries cannot initially compete with established industries in the developed countries. So to allow the manufacturing to get, growing, this argument tells that government should, temporarily support new industries with tariffs, import quotas, or even subsidies until the industry have grown strong enough to meet the international support. So yeah, this argument is actually pretty popular for the government of developing industries during the last 50 years. Nevertheless, many economics remain critical of this argument with two main reasons. First, that the protection of manufacturing from foreign competition does not good unless the protection helps make the industry efficient. And second, the infant industry argument relies on an assumption that firms are unable to make it efficient long-term investment by borrowing money from the domestic or international capital market. So to be short, what is an infant industry argument? The argument will tell you that an industry should be protected until it can be developed and be viable and become competitive internationally. This argument is accepted as a justification for temporary trade restrictions under the WTO. The question is that when is an industry will grown up? Critics argue that if a country has a potential to develop a viable competitive position, its firms should be capable of raising necessary funds without additional support from the government. So the next argument is the strategic trade policy. This argument has two components. First, it's argued that by appropriate actions, a government can help raise national income if it can somehow ensure that firms that gain first mover advantages in the industry are domestic rather than foreign enterprises. Thus, according to the strategic trade policy argument, government should use subsidies to support promising firms that are active in the newly emerging industries. So the second component of the strategic trade policy argument is that it might pay a government to intervene in an industry by helping domestic firms overcome the barriers to entry created by foreign firms that have already reaped first mover advantage. If these arguments are correct, they will support a rationale for government intervention in the international trade. Governments should target technologies that may be important in the future and use subsidies to support the development work aimed at commercializing those technologies. Furthermore, government should provide export subsidies until the domestic firms have established first mover advantage in the world market. Government support might also be justified if it can help domestic firms overcome the first mover advantages enjoyed by foreign competitors and emerge as viable competitors in the world market. So, to be short, what is the argument for strategic trade policy? Well, in cases where there might be important first mover advantages, government can help firms from their countries attain these advantages. Government can help firms overcome the barriers to entry to industries where foreign firms have initial advantage. So that's the two of the economic arguments for government intervention, the infant industry argument and the strategic trade policy argument. So we come into the next slide. We're going to discuss about the revised case for free trade, or in the other word, when should the government avoid using trade barriers? So the first, so the so before we talk about when should the government avoid using trade barriers or the revised case for the free trade, the strategic trade policy arguments of the new trade theories suggest an economic justification for government intervention in the international trade. This justification challenged the rationale for unrestricted free trade found in the work of classic trade theorists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo. In response to this challenge to economic orthodoxy, a number of the economists, including some of those responsible for the development of the new trade theories, such as Paul Krugman, point out that although strategic trade policy looks appealing in theory, in practice, it may be unworkable. So this response to strategic trade policy argument that we already talked about in the last slide constitutes the revised case for free trade. So the first that we are going to talk about retaliation and trade war. So Paul Krugman argues that a strategic trade policy aimed at establishing domestic firms in a dominant position in a global industry is a bigger Thai neighbor policy that boosts national income at the expense of other countries. A country that attempts to use such policies will probably provoke retaliation. In many cases, the resulting trade war between two or more interventionist governments will leave all countries involved worse off than if they had adopted a hands-off approach in the first place. Krugman might be right about the danger of strategic trade policy leading to a trade war. So the problem, however, is how to respond when one competitors are already being supported by the government subsidies. According to Krugman, the answer is that probably not to engage in retaliation retaliatory action, but to help establish rules of the game that minimize the use of trade distorting subsidies. So let's talk about the next revised case for free trade, which is the domestic policies. Government don't Government do not always act in a national interest when they intervene in the economy. Politically important interest groups are often influence the action. So, this has become a further reason for not embracing a strategic trade policy. According to Krugman, is that such a policy is almost certain to be captured by a special interest groups within the economy, who will distort the economy to their own ends. To be short, the in-government intervention, according to Krugman, will or can resulting in a retaliation and trade war, and also distorting the domestic policies. Okay, so thank you for listening, and we're going to discuss the next topic with my friend.
Hello, my name is Hyacintha, and I'm going to talk about From Smith to the Great Depression. So, the first thing first, we're going to talk about back in 1846 in Great Britain, the free trade was born, and the first form of free trade laws is called the Corn Law. The Corn Law placed a high tariffs on imported corn from foreign countries. So the tariff was made to raise government income and to protect British corn producers. They were designed to keep grain prices high to favor the domestic producers. However, this law is so debatable, and so especially during the effect of harvest failure in Great Britain, and it get worsened by the famine happening in Ireland, so it had to be taken down. So the next 80 years after the harvest failure, the Great Britain pushed their trading partners to reciprocate their British policy of unilateral free trade, pushing the case that for trade liberalization, but the other countries didn't do it. So the only thing that why Britain keeps their corn law is because they were the biggest trading nation at that time, and they were afraid of losing the trade war. By the 1930s, the British attempt to stimulate free trade was failed by the Great Depression. So the Great Depression occurred because the world has failed to recover its economic system prior the World War One, and it gets worsened by the U.S. market collapse, also their bank run happening at that time. So instead of trying to fix the problem happening in U.S., the U.S. Made a Smoot-Hawley tariff. This tariff is aimed to avoid rising unemployment by protecting domestic industries and diverting consumer from consuming foreign products and put more interest in their domestic products. Smoot-Hawley Act put a tariff in an imported product. So this law put U.S. in a winning position. And that time, U.S. became the world biggest creditor nation. But since then, the Smoot-Hawley Act have a negative impact on employment in other countries abroad. So they follow the U.S. lead and make their own Smoot-Hawley Act. And that's why U.S. export tumbled down and the world slid into the Great Depression. Economic damage caused by Smoot-Hawley Act was giving a strong influence in the economic institution and the ideology of the post-World War II, so that U.S. led the other countries to establish a GATT and promote a free trade. GATT was a multilateral agreement which objective was to liberalize trade by eliminating tariffs, subsidies, import quotas, and so on. And so, what does it means to be liberalized trade? GATT member grew from 19 countries to more than 120 nations, and they didn't attempt to liberalize the trade by one step. Instead, they rounding up this, they made this trade liberalization through 8 rounds from Geneva to the latest one is happening in Uganda. Sorry, I mean Uruguay. Through these 8 rounds, GATT tried to reduce the world's import tariffs gradually. The last round in Uruguay, they negotiated a mutual tariff reduction among all members, so who then committed themselves not to raise import tariffs above negotiated rate. Here's the interesting part. So GATT has been so strict about the violation of their rules, so that when one of the country trading partner was violating the regulation, the country can ask Geneva-based bureaucracy that administered the GATT to investigate. If the report were found true, the member countries could be asked to pressure the offending party or the cheating country to change the policy. And if they deny it or don't want to change their policy, so they could, the worst case, they could be expelled. During the 80s, GATT was under pressure from around the world. The countries from around the world told them to to support protectionism, and there are 3 reasons that caused it. The first one is Japan's economic success. Japan's economic success trained the world trading system as the opposing country of the US. Japan's economic was ruined as GATT was created, but by the end of 80s, Japan became world's second largest economy, and Japan was succeeded in industries such as automobiles, and semiconductors, and that's how they gained their powers in the world. But Japanese market were closed to imports and foreign investment by trade barriers. So they kept exporting but limiting their import activities. The second one is United States trade deficit. So the world trading system was hit by a trade deficit in the US. The deficit was peaked in 1987 and still going until 1992. From the political view, the matter was worsened in 1992 by the 45 billion US trade deficit with Japan, a country which perceived as not playing by the rules. This resulting a rise in unemployment rate, so people demand for protection against import in the US. And the third one, the trend shifted to greater protectionism because many countries found a way to get around GATT regulations. Bilateral voluntary export restraints, or we call FIRST, find a way around find a way around GATT agreements because neither the importing country or the exporting country complain to the GATT bureaucracy in Geneva, and without a complaint, GATT can't do anything. Exporting countries agreed to first to avoid more damaging tariffs. For example, first between Japan and US to end their trade war was by oppressing Japan to limit their auto imports into the US as a way of diffusing growing trade tension. So the last round of GATT before with WTO was built is the Uruguay round. The Uruguay round is the 8th round of negotiation to reduce import tariffs. This was the most difficult round because it was the most ambitious. The WTO was established in this round of GATT. Until then, GATT rules only applied into manufactured goods such as such as commodities. But since the Uruguay round GATT rules also apply to the trade in service. The Uruguay round contained these provisions. The first one, tariffs on industrial goods were to be reduced by more than one-third, and tariffs were to be scrapped on more than 40% of manufactured goods. Second one, average tariffs rates imposed by developed nation on manufactured goods were to be reduced to less than 4% of value, the lowest level in modern history. Third one, agricultural subsidies were to be substantially reduced. And the fourth one, GATT fair trade and market access rule were extended to cover a range of services. Next, the GATT rules also were to be extended to provide enhanced protection for patents, copyrights, and trademarks, or as we call it, intellectual properties. The sixth one, barriers on trade in textiles were to be significantly reduced over 10 years. And the last one, the WTO was to be created to implement the GATT agreement. Since Uruguay round and WTO was created, GATT rules to cover services and intellectual property may be particularly significant. Before GATT, the eighth round in Uruguay happening, GATT rules only apply to industrial goods such as manufacturing and commodities. The extension of GATT rules to this important trading area could significantly increase both the total share of world trade accounted for by services and the overall volume of world trade. The extension of GATT rules also regulate the intellectual property, and it will make it much easier for high-tech companies to do business in developing countries. For example, in Indonesia, where intellectual property rules poorly enforced, the GATT rules helped high-tech companies to protect their intellectual property in Indonesia. Indonesia actually nowadays have already this law to protect intellectual property and called hak kekayaan intelektual. But the application and enforcement are still poorly regulated. So GATT rules also have international firms to protect their intellectual property in Indonesia.
Hello everyone, I will continue to share about this discussion. The first one, World Trade Organization, the experience studied. World Trade Organization had 150 members, including China, which joined at the end 2001, and another 25 countries, including the Russian Federation and the Ukraine, were negotiating for membership into the organization to promote global free trade. World Trade Organization as global policy. In 1995 until 2007, more than 360 trade disputes between member countries were brought to the World Trade Organization, whereas there were 196 cases handled by GATT, of which three-quarters had been resolved through informal consultation between the countries in dispute. Countries that use the World Trade Organization are countries that believe in the importance of procedures in resolving organizational disputes. Next, I will discuss about the expanding trade agreements. So, World Trade Organization was given the role of brokering for future agreements to open up global trade in service. In February 1997, World Trade Organization acted as a mediator to get approval from various countries to open up the telecommunication markets and compete in that market and allow foreign operators to purchase ownership stakes in domestic telecommunication providers and establish a set of common rules for fair competition. Many telecommunication companies respond positively to the deal because it would give them a much greater ability to offer their business customer one-stop shopping, a global, seamless service for all their corporate needs, and a single bill. In December 1997, there was an agreement to liberalize cross-border trade in financial services. This agreement deals with more than 95% of the world's financial service markets. In March 1999, 102 countries signed to open to varying degrees their banking, securities, and insurance sector to foreign competition. 70 countries agreed to dramatically lower or eradicate barriers to foreign direct investment in their financial service sector. As part of the deal, many Asian countries made important concessions that allow significant foreign participant in their financial service sector for the first time. World Trade Organization in Seattle. In the end, November 1999, representatives from the World Trade Organization member states met in Seattle, Washington, to discuss this problem and to launch a new round of talk, the Millennium Round, and at further reducing barriers to cross-border trade and investment. But on 3rd December 1999, there was a conflict between the United States and European Union. The US agreed to remove the subsidies for agricultural exporters, while the European Union didn't agree about it. Then United States to write basic labor rights into the law of the World Trading System. The United States want the World Trade Organization to allow government to impose tariff on goods imported from countries that didn't abide by what the United States saw as fair labor practice. Because of this, many organizations consider that the Water Organization is an undemocratic institution because it seizes the national sovereignty of these member countries and makes an unilateral decision. The environmentalists express concern about the impact of free trade in agricultural products on global deforestation rates. Many argue that lower timber import tariff from developing countries will result in more demand, resulting in more deforestation. In addition, many unions are against trade laws that allow import from low-wage countries because they result in jobless in high-wage countries. Supporters of the World Trade Organization and free trade disagree on this because they think that the World Trade Organization will serve the interests of these member countries. The World Trade Organization can allow member countries to impose retaliatory tariffs on countries that do not comply with World Trade Organization rules. However, there are around 110 World Trade Organization members who are representative of developing countries who reject this. Many poor countries depend on export because they aim to increase economic growth for fear that rich countries will use environmental and human rights problems to become barriers to the entry developing country products. The pro-trade argument was not heard, so there was a demonstration in Seattle. Next, I will share about the future of the World Trade Organization. World Trade Organization has become a magnet for various groups protesting free trade. The agenda of the World Trade Organization are first, the rise of anti-dumping policies. Second, the high level of protectionism in agriculture. Third, the lack of strong protectionism in agriculture. Fourth, the lack of strong protection for intellectual property rights in many nations. And the last one is continued high tariff on non-agricultural goods and services in many nations. Anti-dumping policies. World Trade Organization rules allow countries to impose anti-dumping duties on foreign goods that are being sold cheaper than at home or below their cost of production. When domestic producers can show that they are being harmed, anti-dumping actions seem to be concentrated in certain sectors of the economy such as metal industries, chemicals, plastics, and machinery and electrical equipment. Protectionism in agriculture. Tariff rates on agricultural products are generally much higher than tariff rates on manufactured products or services. For example, in the middle of the first decade of the century, the average tariff rates on non-agricultural products were 4.2% for Canada, 3.8% for the European Union, 3.9% for Japan, and 4.4% for the United States. On agricultural products, however, the average tariff rates were 21.2% for Canada, 15.9% for the European Union, 18.6% for Japan, and 0.3% for the United States. The implication is that consumers in these countries are paying significantly higher price than necessary for agricultural products imported from abroad, which leaves them with less money to spend on other goods and services. The historically high tariff on agricultural products reflect a desire to protect domestic agriculture and traditional farming communities from foreign competition. According to estimates from the OECD, government subsidies on average account for some 70% of the cost of agricultural products in Canada, 21% in the United States, 35% in the European Union, and 59% in Japan. In total, OECD countries spend more than $300 billion a year in subsidies to agricultural producers. The combination of high tariff barriers and significant subsidies introduce significant distortion into the production of agricultural products and international trade of those products. The net effect is to raise price to consumer, reduce the volume of agricultural trade, and encourage the overproduction of products that are heavily subsidized, with the government typically buying the surplus. Protecting intellectual property. Threats or threat-related aspects of intellectual property rights regulation oblige World Trade Organization members to grant and enforce patents lasting at least 20 years and copyrights lasting 50 years. Rich countries had to comply with the rules within a year. Poor countries in which such protection generally was much weaker had 5 years, and the very poorest had 10 years. The basis of this agreement was a strong belief among signatory nations that the protection of intellectual property through patents, trademarks, and copyrights must be an essential element of the international trading system. Inadequate protection for intellectual property reduce the incentive for innovation. Because innovation is a central engine of economic growth and raising living standards, the argument has been that a multilateral agreement is needed to protect intellectual property. Market access for non-agricultural goods and services. Average tariffs are low. High tariff rates persist on certain imports into developed nations with limited market access and economic growth. For example, Australia and South Korea, both OECD countries, still have bond tariff of 15% and 24.6% respectively on imports of transportation equipment. Bond tariff rates are highest rate that can be charged, which is often but not always the rate is charged. In contrast, the bond tariff rates on imports of transportation equipment into the United States, European Union, and Japan are 2.7% and 4.8% and 0%. A particular area for concern in high tariff rates on imports of selected goods from developing nations into developed nations. In addition, tariff and service remain higher than on industrial goods. The average tariff on business and financial service imported into the United States, for example, is 8.2% into the European Union. It is 8.5% into Japan. It is 19.7%. The World Trade Organization would like to bring down tariff rates still further and reduce the scope for the selective use of high tariff rates. The ultimate aim is to reduce tariff rates to zero. Empirical work suggests that further reduction in average tariff rates towards zero would yield substantial gains. World Trade Organization launched a new round of talks at Doha, Qatar in 2001. The agenda includes first, cutting tariff on industrial goods and services; two, phasing out subsidies to agricultural producers; three, reducing barriers to cross-border investment; and the last one, limiting the use of anti-dumping laws.
A study has conducted to estimate the gains to the American economy from free trade. According to the study, by 2003, GDP of US was 7.3 higher than ever. This benefit the American household roughly $9,000 per year. On this study, it's also stated what's going to happen if America ending a free trade deals with all its trading partners, reducing tariff barriers on all goods and services to zero. The study concluded that that additional annual gains of between 450 billion and 1.3 trillion could be realized. This amount could expected to raise incomes of American households by an additional $4,500 per year. The authors of the study also estimate the scale and cost of employment disruption that would be caused by a free trade. Many jobs would be lost in a certain sector and moved to a new sector if the country abolished all tariff barriers. And this will cost the US a higher unemployment rate. Although by 2/3 of those losing jobs would find re-employment by 1 year, re-employment, however, would be at a wage that was 13 to 14% lower. To offset all this loss that may be experienced by the US, there must be a higher economic growth resulting from a free trade, which created many new jobs and raised household income. And to those whose job was disrupted, would have to sacrifice a bit for the common goods. And adding the explanation from Diaz about Doha Round, beside the agenda, countries with a big pharmaceutical sector accept the fact but not protesting to demands from African, Asian, and Latin American countries on the issue of drug patents. Specifically, the agreement declares that WTO does not and should not prevent members from protecting public health. This was meant to assure the world poorest nation that they can make or buy generic drugs to fight diseases such as AIDS and malaria. The sick and poor countries will also benefit from the guaranteed access to cheaper medicines, and the developed countries such as US, EU, and Japan will lose from this agreement. The losers include environmental activists and the drug firms in the developed countries. Next, we're going to talk about the implication for managers. Why should the international manager care for the political economy of free trade? It's all because there are two factors. The first one is the impact on firm strategy. By considering the fact that trade barriers constrain a firm's ability to disperse their production activities in many countries. The second one, the cost of exporting products is expensive. So this put the firms in a competitive disadvantage. So firm will locate production sites inside the country instead of importing their products. So it will make it cheaper for them to market their product in that country. Quota law makes it harder for firm to market their product. So firm will locate production facilities in that country to make it easier for them to market their product in that particular country. And in order to obey the local content regulation, firm have to locate more production activities in given market. Even with no trade barriers, firms still want to locate some production activities in some country just to anticipate the threat of trade barriers being imposed in the future. All these activities that I mentioned earlier will raise the firm's cost higher. However, the higher cost isn't always a competitive disadvantage because trade barriers apply to all firms as well, and no matter where the firm originated. The second concern is that managers need to figure out the role that firms can play in promoting free trade or trade barriers. Many big firms can influence the government decision to support or oppose the WTO policies on the open market. So thus government policies can have a direct impact on many businesses. The government intervention has three drawbacks. The first one is intervention can be self-defeating, since it tends to protect the inefficient rather than giving firms chance to become a global competitors. The second one, intervention is likely to be dangerous because it may invite retaliation and trigger trade war. And the third one, intervention is unlikely to be well executed. Thank you.
My name is Nadhira Kamila, and I'm going to discuss about the closing case of this chapter titled Dixon Ticonderoga, Victim of Globalization. So Dixon Ticonderoga is one of the oldest public companies in the United States. The company's flagship product is the Abacus No. 2 yellow pencil introduced in 1913. But the 1990s proved to be a very difficult decade. It's not that people are no longer buying pencils, but in fact, demand for pencils in the United States have soared. But the thing is, an increasing proportion of these pencils have been from China. The problem began in the early 90s when Chinese manufacturers entered the market with low-priced pencils. The industry tried to fight back, arguing that the Chinese were dumping pencils on the US market at below cost and lobbying Washington for protection. In 1994, when foreign pencil imports accounted for 16% of the market, the US enacted heavy anti-dumping duties on Chinese pencils, and it's effective to raise their price. Imports fell dramatically, but the Chinese kept making better, cheaper pencils, and after a couple of years, imports returned to the original levels attained before the imposition of duties. In the mid-2000s, the United States renewed duties on pencil imports from China, imposing import tariffs as high as 53% on some brands. In the meantime, Dixon tried several experiments to find cheaper ways to make their pencils. They tried making pencils from recycled paper cases and also shifted to using lower-priced Indonesian dilettong wood. Dixon also started to buy erasers for its pencils from a Korean supplier rather than its traditional US supply. Despite these steps, the company continued to lose share to imports, and by 1999, it was beginning to lose money too. Dixon realized that it could bring unfinished pencils cheaper than it could manufacture them in the United States, so Dixon established a manufacturing operation in Mexico. In another strategic move, in 2000, Dixon created a wholly owned subsidiary in China which manufactures wooden slats for pencil manufacturing. The lead for pencils, or carbon, is still made in the US by Dixon, while the erasers are shipped from Korea. The Chinese subsidiary is also responsible for the production and the distribution of certain products that are sold internationally. So the first question would be, why do you think that the Chinese apparently have a cost advantage in the production of pencils? So we think that China has several comparative advantages that is widely known, such as low wages and productive labor force. They also have a huge factories that can also minimize their costs. Other than that, they tend to focus more on the quantity sold rather than the profit margin generated from each sold products. Although the US have imposed anti-dumping duties on China, it still managed to return to its previous imported quantity. China was also able to make even cheaper pencils and overcome the tariffs. The next question is, do you think that lobbying the US government to impose anti-dumping duties on imports of pencils from China is a good way to protect American jobs? Who benefits most from such duties and who loses? What alternative policy stance might the government take? So we think that the government should intervene in any ways possible because the industry is going to suffer even more if they don't. So the anti-dumping duties is a good way to protect not only American jobs, but the continuity of the pencil industry in the US itself. And also the ones who will benefit from this anti-dumping law is, of course, the pencil industry and everyone else connected to it. The US economy will also be benefited since anti-dumping law will enable producers to compete in prices. On the other hand, consumers will lose since tariff is burdened to the consumers. And therefore, consumers will have to pay higher prices for pencils. Other policy might work is quota, but as an alternative, government can offer assistance to create a more efficient production process. The third question is, Dixon is now a multinational company. Why has Dixon become a multinational? What are the economic benefits to Dixon of becoming an international business? Dixon now operates in a few countries. Recalling the last passage, the lead for the pencils is still made in the US, while the erasers are shipped from Korea. The Chinese subsidiary is also responsible for the production and the distribution of certain products that are sold internationally. Other than that, Dixon also owns a manufacturing factory in Mexico that first acted as a supplementary factory. It then made them realize that they need to be more aggressive and switched many of its processes from the United States to Mexico, although having to lose a lot of jobs in America. But doing so, Dixon managed to produce their pencils more cheaply, and therefore they can compete with other strong nations such as China. And the last question is, now that Dixon has a production operation in China, why does it not simply import finished pencils from China to the US instead of making those pencils in Mexico? So previously, in mid-2000, the US reimposed an import tariff towards Chinese pencil imports. If Dixon decided to simply import them from China, then they would also be subjected to those tariffs. China also has a different political economy than the US, so it might be that Dixon also wants to play it safe with not finishing their production in China. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions or opinions, please feel free to do so. Thank you very much.